The instructors in this video program will demonstrate select major maintenance procedures for a Solar GS4000 turbine. Major maintenance procedures typically should be performed after every 8,000 hours of engine operation. When complete maintenance work, always check your operation and maintenance manual for specific procedures and safety precautions. Warnings and safety precautions are given throughout this video program. Always follow these precautions when completing maintenance procedures. Inspection of the throttle valve is performed as part of the major maintenance inspection. In section 1 of the videotape, you'll see inspection of the gas-fuel throttle valve. An inspection of a dual fuel throttle valve is performed in section 2. During the procedure in each section, you will inspect throttle valves for physical damage, security of linkage, and proper operation. Section 1. Gas-fuel throttle valve inspection. Check your operating and maintenance instructions for warnings and safety precautions that pertain to this inspection. Before you begin, shut down the unit. Turn the master switch off. Then tag it. Visually inspect gas-fuel throttle valve for physical damage such as bent or broken linkage and external corrosion. Replace or clean components as necessary. Now, either manually or using the engine systems, move the linkage to check for binding or sticking. Note, if the actuator or linkage binds or sticks, correct the problem before continuing. Using the proper tools, check the mounting hardware and lines for security. Be sure the mounting hardware is tight. Check the actuator for the correct stroke. Begin by disconnecting the throttle linkage. Be sure not to upset or move turnbuckles. Move the actuator to the fully extended or minimum fuel position. This is done by motoring the engine with the starters. Prevent the linkage from jamming by holding or wiring the linkage out of the way. Warning, do not place your fingers in the path of the actuator while motoring the engine, or bodily injury may result. With the master switch in local position, press and release the reset button. Then, turn the detergent wash switch or crank switch on. Motoring the engine will cause system pressure to increase, and the actuator will move to the fully extended or minimum fuel flow position. With the actuator in the fully extended position, use a scale to measure the actuator stroke. This measurement should be 1.5 plus or minus 1/10 of an inch from the actuator to the edge of the bracket. Now, turn the detergent wash or crank switch off. Then reconnect the linkage after measuring the stroke. Now check the minimum fuel stop setting. Begin by motoring the engine. This causes the actuator to extend to the minimum fuel position. Next, using a feeler gauge, measure the gap between the shoulder screw on the throttle valve and the minimum fuel flow stop. This measurement should be 2/1000th to 5/1000ths of an inch. Adjust the throttle linkage to obtain this measurement. Note, do not attempt to adjust the minimum fuel stop. It is factory set and must not be adjusted. Check the package schematic and wire diagram for the wire number and terminal location for the leads to the fuel control actuator. Remove one of the leads. This will cause the actuator to move to the fully tracted or maximum fuel flow position. Now, use a feeler gauge to measure the gap between the shoulder screw and the maximum fuel flow stop. The minimum clearance should be 2/1000th of an inch. The maximum fuel flow stop should not be adjusted if the clearance is greater than 2/1000ths of an inch. After checking the maximum fuel flow set screw, reinstall lead to the fuel control actuator. Observe that the actuator fully extends. Stop the engine and return the control switches to their normal position. Check the turnbuckles and jam nuts for security using the proper tools. This completes the inspection of the gas-fuel throttle valve linkage. Section 2, Dual Fuel Throttle Valve Inspection. Be sure to follow all the safety precautions shown in Section 1 of this job program. On dual fuel units, perform the inspection on both the gas fuel linkage and the liquid fuel linkage. A piece of cardboard is used in this inspection to make the parts more visible. Inspection is accomplished in the same manner as the gas fuel unit, except for the linkage adjustments. First, check for physical damage to the linkage. Be sure to replace damaged components and correct any binding or sticking problems before continuing the inspection. Next, check the mounting hardware for security using the proper tools. Note, on dual fuel units, the gas and liquid fuel linkages must be adjusted separately. First, check the actuator for the correct stroke. Begin by disconnecting both the gas fuel linkage and the liquid fuel linkage. Be sure not to upset or move the turnbuckles. Prevent the linkage from jamming by wiring it out of the way. Monitor the engine using the detergent wash switch or crank switch. This will cause the actuator to move to the fully extended or minimum fuel flow position. Using a scale, measure the actuator stroke. This measurement should be 1.5 plus or minus 1/10 of an inch from the actuator to the edge of the bracket. Turn the detergent wash or crank switch off. And reconnect the gas fuel linkage. Be sure the liquid fuel linkage will not jam during actuator extension. Now, check the minimum fuel stop setting. Begin by motoring the engine. This will cause the actuator to extend to the minimum fuel position. Using a feeler gauge, measure the gap between the shoulder screw on the throttle valve and the minimum fuel flow stop. This measurement should be 1.5 thousandths to 3/1000th of an inch. Adjust the throttle linkage to obtain this measurement. No, do not attempt to adjust the minimum fuel stop. It is factory set and must not be adjusted. Check the package schematic and wire diagram for the wire number and terminal location for the leads to the fuel control actuator. Remove one of the leads. This will cause the actuator to move to the fully retracted or maximum fuel flow position. Then use a feeler gauge to measure the gap between the shoulder screw and maximum fuel flow stop. The minimum clearance should be 2/1000ths of an inch. The maximum fuel flow stop should not be adjusted if the clearance is greater than 2/1000ths of an inch. Now, reconnect the lead to the fuel control actuator. Observe the actuator fully extends. Now, turn off the crank switch. Then, check the turnbuckles and jam nuts for security using the proper tools. This concludes adjustment of the gas fuel linkage. The first step in the liquid fuel linkage adjustment is to reconnect the linkage at the liquid fuel control lever assembly. Motor the engine to move the actuator to the fully extended or minimum fuel flow position. Next, use a feeler gauge to measure the gap between the minimum liquid fuel flow set screw and the arm on the liquid fuel valve. This measurement should be 5/1000th to 7/1000th of an inch. Adjust the liquid fuel gauge to obtain this measurement. Note, do not attempt to adjust the minimum fuel flow set screw. It is factory set and must not be adjusted. Now, stop the engine and return the control switches to their normal position. Upon completion of this adjustment, check all linked hardware for security. The maximum liquid fuel flow stop is not adjustable as it is internal to the unit. This completes the inspection of the dual fuel throttle valve linkage. Inspection of the torch and spark plug is performed as part of the major maintenance inspection. During this procedure, you'll check the torch assembly for carbon buildup, erosion, cracks, or damage. You'll also measure the spark plug gap and adjust it if necessary. Check your operation and maintenance instructions for warnings and safety precautions that pertain to the torch and spark plug inspection. Shut down the unit. Turn master switch off. Then tag it. Warning: be sure the post lube is complete prior to securing the fuel and service gas. Turn off fuel and service gas. Then tag the valves. Turn off the circuit breakers and tag them. Begin by removing the gas line to the torch. Then cap the end of the gas line to prevent entry of foreign objects. Next, move the igniter plug lead from the spark plug, being careful not to damage the ceramic insulator. Inspect the insulator and cable tip for damaged or broken hardware. Replace the cable assembly if needed. Now, loosen the igniter plug, but do not remove it at this time. This will allow the torch to be removed as an assembly. To remove the torch assembly, remove the 4 nuts and bolts which hold it to the combustor case. Use a rocking motion to separate the torch from the combustor case. And carefully remove the torch assembly and gasket. Inspect and replace the gasket as necessary. Cover the engine opening to prevent entry of foreign objects. Remove the spark plug, then inspect and clean plug if necessary. Then check the plug electrode for carbon buildup, erosion, and damage. Use a rocking motion to remove the torch tube. Some torch tubes can be difficult to remove because of carbon buildup or tight-fitting components. Inspect the torch tube for carbon buildup, erosion, cracks, or damage. Inspect the torch housing for carbon buildup, erosion, cracks, or damage. Check that the orifice in the housing is not plugged or obstructed. Note, the orifice will be open to ensure that the torch operates properly. Clean all parts prior to assembly. Now assemble the torch components for installation. Reinstall the torch tube in the housing using a rocking motion. While installing torch tube, be sure the spark plug hole in both the housing and tube line up. Check the plug gap. It should be 8/100ths to 10/100ths of an inch. Adjust the gap as required. Then install the plug gasket and install the plug in the housing. Be sure to clean the torch mounting surface on the combustor case. This will ensure proper seating of the torch assembly. Install the torch gasket and install the torch assembly. Use the 4 nuts and bolts to secure the torch assembly to the combustor. Tighten the plug and torque it to 300 to 360 inch-pounds. Remove the protective plug from the torch gas line and connect it to the housing. Tighten the line to prevent a gas leak. Install the igniter cable and tighten it. Tightening the nut, hold the lead to prevent it from turning. Be sure to check the components prior to returning the units to service.
Inspection of the reduction drive gearbox is performed as part of the major maintenance inspection. During this inspection, you will check the air inlet and reduction drive gearbox for oil leaks, loose or damaged hardware, and signs of abnormal operating conditions. Check your operation and maintenance instructions for warnings and safety precautions prior to performing this inspection. Shut down the unit. Turn the master switch off. Then tag it. Begin by checking for leaks in the area where the gearbox mounts to the air housing. Next, visually check the hardware mounted on the unit for leaks and security. Tighten loose hardware. Next, check the opposite side of the gearbox and air housing using the same procedures as shown. Check for leaks when the unit is restarted. Inspection of the rear engine mount is performed as part of the major maintenance inspection. Inspect the rear engine mount for physical damage and secure mounting hardware. Check your operation and maintenance instructions for warnings and safety precautions prior to performing this inspection. Shut down the unit. Turn the master switch off. Then tag it. Begin by inspecting the rear engine mount for any physical damage, such as bent, warped, or cracked surfaces. Check that the mounting hardware is secure by using the appropriate tools. If the hardware is loose, tighten it. Now visually inspect the load springs for signs of damage. Next, measure the preload height. This is done by using a scale to check the dimensions stamped on each corner of the pad. If the measurements are not within the limits specified in the operation and maintenance instructions, adjust the height by adding or removing shims as necessary. Be sure that any hardware attached to the rear engine mount is secure. This completes the rear engine mount inspection.
The thermocouple is inspected as part of the major inspection procedure. To perform the thermocouple inspection, you will remove the harness, inspect the thermocouples for signs of damage, and replace them if necessary. Then you will perform a functional test and install thermocouple harness on the engine. Be sure to check your operation and maintenance manual for warnings and safety precautions that pertain to thermocouple inspections. Turn the master switch and the fuel and service exhaust gas off before you begin the maintenance procedure. Caution, be sure the post-lube cycle is complete before securing the fuel and exhaust gas. To gain access to the thermocouples, you must move the engine insulation blankets. Warning, allow the engine to cool before removing the insulation blankets. First, remove the safety wire holding the blankets in place. Be careful not to cut yourself on the sharp edges of the blankets. Slide the blankets forward. This will give you access to the mount bolts. Remove the mounting bolts and nuts from each connection point on the harness. There are a total of 6 connection points, 3 on each harness. You may have to spray the bolts with penetrating oil to loosen them for removal. Carefully remove the harness. It can be done by starting at either end of the harness and moving the harness in the direction of the thermocouple being removed. Continue the procedure until all 3 thermocouples have been removed. Cover the openings to prevent entry of foreign objects. Visually inspect the thermocouples for signs of erosion, broken or bent wires, nicked, dented, or punctured insulating tubes, or other visible damage. Replace the harness if any damage is noted. You have finished inspecting the thermocouple. Now you will perform the functional test. With the harness connected electrically, turn the master switch on. Warning, in the next step, do not use an open flame in a hazardous area. Apply heat to each thermocouple and observe the engine temperature meter for movement. If no movement is indicated, replace harness. Next, clear the mounting surfaces and replace the gaskets. Install the harness in mounting holes in the combustor. Be careful not to damage the thermocouple or harness during installation. Install the 6 nuts and bolts to secure the harness to the engine. To keep from dropping the nuts, put a piece of tape on the wrench. Repeat the inspection procedure for the remaining harness. Reposition the insulation blanket around the combustor. Safety wire the blanket in place by interlacing the wire along the top of the blanket. This concludes the inspection of the thermocouple.
The removal and visual inspection of the pneumatic starters when installed is performed as part of the major maintenance inspection. During this inspection, verify the physical condition of components. This will ensure reliable operation of the starters during the start cycle. Be sure to check your operation and maintenance instructions prior to performing this inspection. Prior to performing maintenance, shut down the unit. Now turn the master switch off, then tag the switch. Warning, be sure the post lube is complete prior to securing the fuel and service gas. Secure the fuel and service gas supply to the package by closing the manual shutoff valves. Tag the valves as you close them. Turn off the circuit breakers and tag them. First, visually inspect the starters for damage, corrosion, and evidence of oil leakage. Next, perform the following steps to remove each starter, ensuring that the pneumatic supply to the starters is turned off. First, spray penetrating oil on 8 lock nuts that retain the starter to the mounting pad. This will aid in their removal. remove 4 bolts from the split flange clamps that hold the inlet hose to the starter adapter. Note, this can also be done by removing 2 bolts and loosening the remaining 2. While holding the inlet hose, carefully remove the split flange clamps from around the connection. Then remove the hose and cover the opening to prevent entry of foreign objects. Now remove split flange clamps and hose on the exhaust or outlet side of the starter using the same procedure as shown previously. Next, remove 7 of the 8 lock nuts and washers that hold the starter to the mounting pad. Now support the starter and remove the remaining nut and washer. Warning: the pneumatic starter is very heavy. Exercise extreme care during its removal to avoid injury to yourself and damage to the equipment. Carefully remove the starter from the mounting pad by pulling it straight out. Next, remove and discard the starter gasket. Prior to covering the engine opening, visually inspect the starter clutch gear for damage, corrosion, or gear teeth wear. Check to ensure the clutch gear only moves freely in one direction. Be sure to cover the engine opening to prevent the entry of foreign objects. The next phase of the inspection should be performed in a shop equipped with a pressurized air supply. Note, the starter inlet and outlet adapter fittings have been removed to allow for inspection of starter internal components. Inspect the starter housing for damage and corrosion. Clean the starter as necessary. Then inspect the starter motor gear for signs of damage or gear wear. Replace the gear as necessary. Now inspect the motor vanes for damage and corrosion. Look through the starter inlet and outlet ports and inspect each vane by turning the motor shaft with your hand. The motor should turn freely during this procedure with no evidence of shaft binding or vanes rubbing. If the shaft does not turn freely or binds, the motor should be disassembled and repaired using a starter repair kit. If the motor vanes appear dry due to a lack of oil film, check the starter motor lubricator prior to returning the unit to service. Now check the starter motor shaft seal for leakage by first plugging the outlet port. Do not use high-pressure compressed air in the next step or injury may result. Install a plug with fitting into the inlet port. Next, attach the hose to the fitting. Open the pressure valve slowly to apply 207 kPa of air through the inlet port. Using a soap solution, check for leakage around the shaft seal. No leakage is allowed. If there is leakage or if excess oil is present inside the motor or around the shaft seal is leaking and should be replaced. Refer to the pneumatic starter disassembly procedures, the operation and maintenance instructions to replace the shaft seal. Turn off the pressure supply and remove the hose and plugs. Finish cleaning the pneumatic starter as necessary. The starter is now ready for installation on the engine. First, remove the cover from the engine opening. Then, clean the mounting surface, taking care to keep debris out of the clutch gear housing. Install a new starter gasket. Before reinstalling the starter, replace the starter inlet and exhaust fittings. These serve as convenient handholds on the starter. While supporting the starter, align the gears and slide the starter onto the mounting studs. Hold the starter in place while installing the top washer and lock nut. Next, install the remaining nuts and washers. Use a cross-tightening sequence to ensure the starter is seated properly. Torque the lock nuts to 12 to 16 Newton meters. Once the lock nuts have been torqued, tighten the inlet adapter. Then, remove the protective cover from the inlet hose and check that the O-ring is installed. Now secure the hose to the starter adapter using the split flange clamps and bolts. When tightening the clamp bolts, be sure the assembly is properly seated. Then torque the bolts to 33 to 42 Newton meters. Perform the same procedure on the outlet hose of the starter. When reinstallation of the starter is complete, repeat the entire inspection procedure on the remaining starter. Once the inspection of the second starter is complete, check the starter lubricator. If oil is not visible in the lubricator sight gauge, add oil as necessary. This lubricator must be manually replenished at regular intervals. Return the unit to the pre-start condition. The system is now ready for the operational and leak checks. Turn the system select switch to the local position. Press and release the malfunction reset switch and turn the engine crank switch to on. Warning: exercise care when working around the starter flexible lines during the engine start. These lines are flexible before the start, but will become rigid when pressurized. When the engine begins to crank, check the lubricator flow rate with the start system operating. The proper flow rate should be 60 drops per minute. Adjust the lubricator as necessary to obtain this flow rate. When the engine has reached 25 to 30% speed, leak check the start system thoroughly. Then turn off the system and return the control to normal.